Welcome to PBCJ's live coverage of the Lower House. I'm Simone Absalom. The session will start with prayers, followed by a roll call of those in attendance. This is usually followed by questions and answers to questions, statements by ministers, items under public business, and private members' motions. Before we begin, let's try a Parliament trivia. Is this true or false? The House of Representatives has no control over government's finances, meaning funds cannot be granted nor taxation levied with the approval of the House. Stick around for the answer at the end of this introduction. The answer will also be posted on our Facebook page. On the agenda in this session, notices of motions given orally, including the public procurement classification and registration of suppliers regulations. The Tourism Workers Pensions Act 2019 will be tabled. The pension scheme is aimed at providing retirement benefits for all industry workers, whether they're permanent or contract or self-employed. Hotel workers, craft vendors, tour operators, contract carriage operators, among others, will be eligible for benefits that will be payable at age 65 and older. According to Tourism Minister Edmund Bartlett, Tourism Workers' Pension Scheme is in keeping with the government's focus on creating a social security network within the tourism sector. Minister Bartlett said that significant work has been undertaken over the last 2 years to develop the pension plan. It is one component of a 3-point human capital development plan for industry workers, which also includes training and capacity building. The scheme will receive $1 billion in funding from the Tourism Enhancement Fund. The Bauxite and Alumina Industries Encouragement Act will also be tabled. This is an act to make provision for the grant of special concession to producers of Jamaica bauxite and alumina. Under the questions and answers to questions segment, Prime Minister Andrew Holness will answer a question asked by the Member of Parliament for St. Anne Southeastern, Lisa Hanna. Under public business, the National Contracts Commission Validation and Indemnity Act 2019 will be taken. The sectoral debate continues in today's sitting of the Lower House. Minister of Tourism Edmund Bartlett and the opposition's Lisa Hanna is down to make their contributions to the debate. The sectoral debate is a public debate in the House of Representatives in which cabinet ministers and junior ministers report on their performance and their projections of the previous year, while opposition spokespersons on the various portfolios will seek answers and criticize or support government programs and policies. It should be noted that the agenda can be adjusted with items being added or removed or replaced. If you're planning to attend a session at Gordon House, here are some rules you should keep in mind. No visitor shall create any act of disorder within the precincts of the House. No visitor shall be admitted to the House without first obtaining an admission card from the office of the clerk. Visitors who remain within the precincts of the House during a suspension of the session are asked to keep silent. It's about time to go over to the proceedings, but first, the answer to our Parliament trivia. We asked, true or false, the House of Representatives has no control over government's finances. It's false. The truth is, the House of Representatives has control over government's finances, meaning funds cannot be granted nor taxation levied without the approval of the House. Now on to the parliamentary session.
Notice the speaker enters the door, members still speak. They're speaking, and between prayers and after prayers, members are still gossiping and speaking and talking across the aisles. The protocol is, this one you can't speak on it. Let me teach you. No. Before statement by minister, we can speak on that. Let me just teach you the protocol and practice here. Okay? The issue, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that when you enter the speaker enters the house, there's talking across the place. Once the speaker is in the chair and there's prior, you don't open that door and enter the house. You wait until after prior before you enter the house. And secondly, you don't speak until the mace is placed in his position over here. But I know that members consistently breaching that. I've never done that. Consistently breaching that protocol. And I'm asking, Mr. Speaker, that you enforce that rule and advise them. And advise the members and remind them of the protocol in the House. You are one of the most guilty one always coming through the door when the speaker is inside here. Mr. Samuda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today we will be consistent with our undertaking to respond. The Prime Minister will respond to the member from St. Anne Southeast. The question at number one and 2 of item 2 on the question and answer paper. I want to also indicate that we would otherwise have been able to take the question standing in the name of the opposition House Leader. Opposition House Leader, which is item 6. But unfortunately, the Minister is off the island. So every effort will be made for you to get those answers next week. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be making a statement today on the state of the water supply for Kingston and St. Andrew. And then at notice of motion given orally, the public procurement classification and regulation of supplies regulation will be tabled and has in fact been tabled. The Tourism Workers' Pension Act 2019 has also been tabled. The Bauxite and Alumina Industries Engagement Act will be tabled. No.
This is the first reading of the Bauxite.
So we will have a first reading of the Bauxite and Alumina Industries.
Both of them, and then the National
Enactment Act. But you will be taking
the national contracts.
the Validation and Indemnity Act 2019. You will be taking through its stages today. And then, Mr. Speaker, we will be having the presentation by the Honourable Minister of Tourism, who is here in full force, ready to unload all his efforts to be manifested today in the House. And then, of course, we will also hear from the member from Southeast St. Anne, who will be making her contribution to the sectoral debate. Now, well, I think the Prime Minister has generously consented to enable. No.
Questions first, the statement after.
The Prime Minister will do the.
So I'll do the questions first, statement.
Prime Minister, you have a lot of work to do. Don't make them harass you at all.
No, man, the questions first.
Your pace. Right, okay. So the Prime Minister is going to answer the questions first, and then he will make a statement.
No, after the presentation.
After the presentations, as we have developed that custom.
Yes.
That's how it will go today.
So I want this
all right? So he has kindly consented to respond to you first. Ms. Hanna.
Statement by ministers. Statement by ministers.
The Prime Minister has agreed to delay the presentation of the statement on water until we have completed the sectoral debate, which is what we did before, and that's the procedure we will follow, because these good people have come from far away, and we don't want to detain them while we go through the domestic matters, the business matters of the House. They are here to listen to the presentations of their respective members of Parliament and minister and so on. So we will forego that statement by ministers until that process shall have been completed.
I just want to, at this time, members, to welcome our visitors in the gallery. We have with us students and teachers from the Spot Valley High School. I want us to welcome them. And also to welcome the team from the Minister of Tourism and other visitors who are here with us. Welcome. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following: Annual Report of the Universal Service Fund for the year 2017-2018. Annual Report of the E-Learning Jamaica Company Limited for the year 2017-2018. Auditor General's Performance Audit Report on the JCF's Procurement Management. Annual Report of the Integrity Commission for the year 2017. The Integrity Commission's Special Report on Review of Complaint received regarding sales of rooms on the beach by Montego Bay 1975 Limited to Puerto Caribe Properties Limited, and the sale of beachlands by the Urban Development Corporation to Puerto Caribe Properties Limited. The Public Procurement Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulations 2019. That's it. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, it was said that some time ago that the reports would be sent in electronic form, but outside of that, Mr. Speaker. But outside of that, Mr. Speaker.
What report is he speaking about?
Outside of that, Mr. Speaker. Outside of that, Mr. Speaker, we don't have the reports before us.
All right, Mr. Fagan, let me advise you. They are being printed now, so you'll get them shortly.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, are you saying that the reports will be...
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order. When I deal with the report, if the member wishes, I think he's talking about papers laid on the table of the House. That's not a report. That doesn't do report. We're dealing with announcement, and the clerk announced the different documents that were laid on the table of the House. It's not a report, but you need to check your internet if you can read it. It is sent out.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what the member is saying. The report should be out before me. And
Mr. Speaker, will you please advise the member it's not report? It's not report. It's what laid on the table of the House. Not report. Please advise him from me now.
Mr. Fagan, you can have them electronically, and they are being uploaded now. So, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives and its deliberations on the motions for exemptions brought on behalf of the members of Parliament for St. Andrew Southeastern and St. Mary Southeastern.
Notice of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move, be it resolved that the report of the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberations on the motions for exemption brought on behalf of the members of Parliament for St. Andrew Southeastern and St. Mary Southeastern, which was laid on the table of the House on the 30th day of April 2019, be adopted.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Tourism Workers Pension Act 2019.
Accomplishment.
Prosperity name. Prosperity.
Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark.
Mr. Speaker, momentarily distracted. But I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Bauxite and Alumina Industries Encouragement Amendment Act 2019. And Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move to introduce and have read a first time the Public Procurement Classification and Registration of Suppliers Regulations 2019.
Mr. Palway? No. Okay. Questions and answer to questions.
Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Hanna.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the expiration of 21 days, I will ask the Honourable Minister of Economic Growth and Job Creation, who has responsibility for the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, the following questions.
Ms. Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Prime Minister to answer the questions, standing in my name.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions posed by the member from South East Sentan. Will the Prime Minister disclose the specifics of his recent meeting with President Trump of the United States at Mar-a-Lago? Response. On Friday, March 22nd, 2019, the leaders of 5 Caribbean countries, the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, met with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, in Palm Beach, Florida. The meeting was initiated by the United States, and I was invited to attend by the President of the United States. The government of Jamaica reviewed the context of the proposed meeting and the invitation and concluded the following. First, the meeting was in keeping with our foreign policy objective to ensure that Jamaica remains a relevant leader and influential voice in the region. The meeting provided an opportunity for Jamaica to discuss our security and economic interests with our largest trading partner and security partner. there was strong sentiment among regional leaders that the United States had not been paying enough attention to the Caribbean as the third border of the United States. As Prime Minister, and during my tenure as CARICOM chairman, I had previously expressed this view publicly and in several fora, meetings, and engagements with the United States and their officials, including the visit of the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson when he visited Jamaica, a side meeting with Vice President Pence at the Summit of the Americas in Peru, and during my visit to Washington, where I met with several U.S. Senate and congressional leaders, including Marco Rubio, chairman of the United States Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Maxine Waters, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus. The meeting, therefore, provided an opportunity for direct dialogue between leaders of the region and the President of the United States to explore ways of strengthening the bilateral and regional relationships and express and reaffirm the goodwill between the United States and the region. The context of the meeting was the wider Caribbean and not specific to CARICOM. The invitation was extended on a bilateral basis. Nevertheless, the meeting would still provide an opportunity to address issues relevant to CARICOM member states. Before the meeting with President Trump, the invited leaders had a working meeting with the U.S. National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Detailed discussions were had on a range of subjects, including national security and protecting the maritime space of the region through greater support with assets and information sharing, disaster management and resilience building within the context of increased frequency and intensity of weather events, an increased role in the region for the redefined Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, blacklisting, de-risking, and potential loss of correspondent banking services in Caribbean countries, extension of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act, which allows continued one-way duty-free access for Caribbean goods into the United States market beyond 2019, energy security, and stronger economic cooperation, and the situation in Venezuela. The meeting with President Trump focused more on high-level discussions. The President wanted to hear the leaders' perspectives on a range of issues, including the current economic outlook for each country in attendance and for the region generally, areas in which the U.S. could offer greater support, the situation in Venezuela, the respective perspectives of the leaders who attended on Cuba. Specific concerns were raised by Caribbean leaders about the importance of tourism to the region and the extremely dampening effect that travel advisories and warnings had on visitor arrivals from the North American market. The President took a particular interest in this matter and asked that it be looked into. A greater role for OPIC in the region was also discussed as a way to increase investment and support for strategic development imperatives of the region, particularly in energy and infrastructure. Jamaica is already working on a cooperation program with the United States through the Treasury Department in this regard. All leaders present expressed concern over the situation in Venezuela and support for a peaceful and sustainable solution to return the country to stable and democratic government. The second question: has Jamaica given any commitment to the USA that it will be a party of any activity to change the current government in Venezuela? The answer: no.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I appreciate the answers to the questions, and I'm a little disappointed that it took me asking the questions for you to make a statement. I feel that matters such as these warrant such national importance that you are obligated to come to Parliament without being perceived or pursued to answer questions at the behest of the opposition member. Having said that, one of the reasons why I asked the questions, and I think you would have been aware over the last year of my public sentiments towards how your administration has been approaching the business of foreign affairs. There was a time when we took very principled decisions in this particular area. And I fear that some of the decisions have been a little weak-kneed in terms of how we have positioned Jamaica. The reason why it concerns me even further is that when I looked at the countries that were invited to this meeting by President Trump, they were all the countries who voted in support of the United States resolution at the OAS not to recognize Nicolas Maduro. And I'm a little concerned because it would appear that the United States is perhaps trying to divide a very, very principled, non-interfering approach of CARICOM that has been established over successive administrations and using Jamaica as a leader of that divide. I saw it when Tillerson came and he praised yourself and the Minister of Foreign Affairs at your approach to Venezuela. And so my first question to you is, why wasn't the chairman of CARICOM invited if it was such a wide deliberation? Why wasn't the chairman? And I'm concerned if he was not invited, did you ask why he was not invited to that meeting?
Can't answer that.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by addressing the comments made by the member regarding her disappointment that it took a question to provide these answers. Mr. Speaker, there is no action that I take that there is no public record of the action. I go above and beyond to ensure that the public is well informed about the trip, what was discussed. It was, Mr. Speaker, well publicized. We had a brief with the press after the foreign press, and we released statements here. So, Mr. Speaker, having had the meeting and having ensured that the press and social media was properly informed, And then very soon thereafter my return, the question was tabled. So, Mr. Speaker, without being discourteous to the member, instead of having a statement which would obviate the question, we decided, Mr. Speaker, that we would just simply answer the question. Now, Mr. Speaker, just to be clear, in the future, I will not allow myself to be criticized in this way. So I will therefore, when questions are asked, I will obviously now come with statements which would obviate the questions. So I just want to address that first issue. The second issue is why was the chairman not invited, the chairman of CARICOM? Now, I, Mr. Speaker, could not pretend to answer that question. That question can only be answered by the United States government. As I said in my answer, we carefully examined the context of the meeting and the invitation. The invitations were bilaterally extended, and the context of the meeting was to discuss Caribbean-wide affairs, not CARICOM. Based on that, we thought it would be in the interest of Jamaica to have the opportunity to defend our interests with our largest trading partner and our largest security partner. Mr. Speaker, I think that every single Jamaican, despite whatever views they may hold, will ultimately come to the conclusion that the government of Jamaica acted in the best interest of Jamaica. The other question, that was an oversight. The next time I will ensure. Mr. Speaker, forgive the Sotomayor remark. But the other issue raised by the member from Southeast St. Mary is that she fears that Jamaica, St. Anne, forgive me, Dr. Dunn.
She's from St. Mary. She's from St. Mary.
From Southeast St. Anne.
She's from Western St. Mary.
The member says she fears that we are departing from principled foreign policy. And we are very sensitive to that criticism because from our perspective, that is from this administration, we understand our core principles as a country to be the promotion of democracy. We are a democratic society. We also are strong protectors of human rights. By virtue of our own struggles to achieve free and fair elections, we are also strong advocates for free and fair elections. Those to me are our principles. We also maintain a principle that we don't interfere in the internal affairs of countries. And a small country, as a small island developing state, that is of even greater importance to us. So I believe that we have conducted our foreign policy quite consistently and in line with the principles that Jamaicans hold dear and this parliament should hold dear. Because the question would be asked and should be answered by the opposition spokesperson on foreign affairs. Were you the opposition in Venezuela, would you tolerate what was happening in that country? Would you say that the elections there were legitimate? And that, Mr. Speaker, is the ultimate test.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
We have been there before. We know.
The two things. I understand your excitement in thinking that the press and social media are the parliament, but it's not. The issue that I was asking about succinctly, and there is clearly a contradiction in terms, because when you voted at the OAS, you voted with the United States against a sovereign country. So I'm not quite sure what you mean that you have gone down the lines of non-interference. And the reason why I asked you about CARICOM and your views on CARICOM is because after that vote, you actually signed or were part of a meeting. All foreign affairs ministers were part of a meeting with CARICOM, signaling your support for a peaceful resolution. So it appears, certainly from my perspective and from others, that it has been a very flip-flop approach. But let me go forward. The issue as it relates to sanctions, did you discuss any matters surrounding the sanctions on Chinese companies operating in Jamaica, particularly those in the steel and bauxite industries, alumina industries?
So let me again raise the issue of CARICOM and Jamaica's vote, because there has to be clarity. Jamaica voted according to its principles. It was the majority of countries in the OAS voted that the elections were not legitimate. In the OAS, Jamaica, along with the majority of countries, not voting with the US, we voted on a principle. Jamaica has not, and I don't want the two things to be confused, Jamaica has not acknowledged Guaido. We have not. We have not. We have maintained our principle, which is the elections, from our perspective, were not legitimate. But it doesn't mean that that vote. Mr. Speaker, I'm answering the questions asked by the member from Southeast St. Anne. So, Mr. Speaker, we have not acknowledged any other government in Venezuela. What we have voted on was whether or not the elections met international standards for fair and free and transparent. And it was the view of the majority of countries in the OAS that that was not the case, and in the hemisphere. So Jamaica is well placed in terms of its foreign policy. As I said before, the context of the meeting was a Caribbean context, not a CARICOM context. We met and we discussed Jamaica's interests. We pursued energy, we pursued greater investments, we pursued the renewal of the Caribbean-Based Initiative Act. We discussed issues to do, importantly, with security, particularly maritime security. We discussed issues to do with tourism, and I believe that we will probably make some breakthrough there. As I said, all the leaders raised the issue about the travel advisories and the warnings and the effect, the dampening effect they have on visitor arrivals. The President took a particular interest in that and undertook to look into the matter. And I believe that we will see something positive from that. We have struck up a cooperation arrangement between Jamaica and the United States through the Treasury Department, where we are now looking at closer cooperation for investment in energy. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that Jamaica has pursued a principled foreign policy while at the same time advancing our economic interests. To answer the specific questions asked, within the meeting with President Trump, from my notes that I took, there was no discussion about sanctions for Chinese companies. There was no discussion. There was no discussion about sanctions, no, for Chinese companies. And I want to just be clear on that. There was no discussion in the meeting with President Trump about any sanctions for Chinese companies, whether they be in steel or construction or whatever.
Prime Minister, with respect and deference to the member and the Minister of Tourism, I shall only ask a couple more follow-up questions. But just to point out, and perhaps you can clarify for me, when Jamaica voted at the OAS to recognize Guaibo as the legitimate ambassador to the OAS represent Venezuela, what in your mind does that mean in terms of recognition? Because to me, that is recognizing him as a legitimate official representing Venezuela. So where are we on it? You don't recognize Maduro, but then we vote to recognize Guaibo, but you say that you don't recognize Guaibo. Guava.
I just want to be clear, there were two votes. And if I may suggest to you, member, if you write your question to me, I will provide you with a response. I want to be clear which vote it is that you're speaking of. No. There are two votes, so we have to be clear which vote.
Prime Minister, I perhaps you may want to consult with your Minister of Foreign Affairs just to get the details of it, because the two votes were, the last one you mentioned is conflicting with what you were saying, and I really don't want you to give misrepresentation to the House. So essentially, Jamaica and several other countries, members of the OAS, in recognition, Gustavo Tarr as Venezuela's legitimate ambassador to the regional body. So I will ask you the questions. The two final questions that I have for you, Prime Minister. The United States has recently put some severe sanctions, some additional sanctions on Cuba. Were these raised with you at that meeting? On Cuba. I'm moving to Cuba, since you've asked me, and I will acquiesce to your request. Were you asked, or was there any signal given to you that the United States was about to sanction harshly, on top of what is being done to Cuba, additional economic sanctions? And
I mean, I can say definitively, even without looking back at the notes I took, the discussions regarding Cuba were fairly general. The President of the United States wanted to hear from the regional leaders their perspective on Cuba. And I could say that all the leaders there spoke very positive and supportively of Cuba. I believe that the points that were made would have had some, I thought, impact on how the United States would view how the region views Cuba. So I think generally all the leaders spoke positively about Cuba, about reintegrating Cuba, lifting the embargo, all that we have discussed here and debated here. I think that was the general sentiment. There were concerns about Cuba and Venezuela, but in general, I would say that the discussions from the leaders in the region were positive towards Cuba.
Prime Minister, my final question, and the difference perhaps between your approach and our approach is that we see Jamaica as the beacon of CARICOM and the Caribbean at large that doesn't operate only in self-interest, but we work to make sure that we pull everybody together, because in this world, what you need are actually votes together and not individually, because the bigger countries will pick you off and our economy is too small to be allowed to be picked off. So the final question I have for you is this. The next time a country such as the United States invites perceived or individual hand-picked Caribbean countries, will you, as the Prime Minister of Jamaica, make sure that other leaders from CARICOM have a seat at that table?
Mr. Speaker, firstly, we have to weigh, as an independent country, what is in the best interest of Jamaica. We did pursue, as you have asked, whether or not other members could have been invited. In fact, I asked my ambassador to the United States to pursue that, because though my first and foremost interest is the interest of Jamaica, as former chairman of CARICOM and someone who has an interest in the regional process, we did pursue it. I cannot here seek to explain U.S. foreign policy. They have invited bilaterally the countries that they want to sit down with. And from our perspective, it is better that Jamaica is always at the table than not. It is better, Mr. Speaker, that Jamaica's voice is not muted. And I believe that our voice was well heard. And I believe that Jamaica is in a better position.
Yes, we are.
Bear in mind that other countries in CARICOM have gone to other extremes. We are talking here without recognizing that Haiti has pursued a different policy than Jamaica. The Bahamas, they have pursued a different policy. So the idea to try to paint Jamaica as an outlier for the rest of CARICOM is quite unfortunate. Jamaica is actually the country maintaining the balance in CARICOM.
Prime Minister.
Speaker Tony, sit down. Come on, let's just move on. Speaker Tony, sit down.
Dr. Phillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, In relation to Venezuela, there has been an initiative undertaken by CARICOM heads, I think the chairman of CARICOM, and a number of other countries, to get the Secretary General of the United Nations to utilize his good offices to bring about a resolution of the Venezuelan situation. My specific question, does Jamaica support that initiative on the part of the chairman of CARICOM and the other associated CARICOM heads?
I was actually a part of the conference call of heads and foreign ministers that discussed deputizing. I believe at the time it was the chairman of CARICOM, who would be the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, to lead a delegation to the UN. And they also sought to develop the Montevideo mechanism. Yes, we supported it, and we continue to support any effort to reach a peaceful and sustainable resolution for the people of Venezuela.
So in that regard, in relation to Jamaica's vote in the OAS, was there a particular view of how a peaceful resolution would be arrived at in relation to Venezuela, given that the various states in the OAS would have had different viewpoints? There are some states that are speaking explicitly of regime change in the Venezuela situation, and including the prospect of military action. There are others who have other views. Does Jamaica have a specific view as to how this process within Venezuela and the region should play out?
To be clear, we have always maintained that the best solution is for new elections, fresh elections, within a set period of time. And in fact, the last statement from CARICOM, that was the position, that there should be fresh elections. The truth is, Leader of the Opposition, that once we have said that the election is not legitimate, then clearly the solution lies in going back to the people with elections that meet the standards for legitimacy. And I think that is just a fair position.
Prime Minister, may I indulge you?
Mr. Daly.
Prime Minister, having touched on the point of fair elections, the elections in Venezuela were held last May. I think at the time you were the chairman of CARICOM. You may correct me if I'm wrong. Did CARICOM, under your chairmanship, ever discuss the legitimacy of the Venezuela election held May 2018?
Yeah, this was a point that was discussed at several meetings. Indeed, as you know, CARICOM does not have a unified foreign policy. Each country carries their foreign policy. We do coordinate on issues, but we are not a political union per se, so we don't necessarily carry common foreign policy. From that time, Jamaica maintained that there should be a process to ensure fair and free, transparent elections that met international standards, standards that we would accept as being legitimate. We also pursued the strategy of good offices and offered ourselves to assist in negotiations. And the good office strategy was used. Several countries in the region offered to negotiate solutions. I believe even the Vatican at one point in time was involved in trying to use good offices. It is clear that the good offices approach did not work. We still continue to maintain, and I hope that all the members here understand that if there can be a negotiated solution, we would support that as well. But outside of that, it seems to the administration that the only way to bring resolution there would be for fresh elections, free and fair, with a set timetable.
Prime Minister, on the matter of transparency in the foreign policy, recently your foreign minister signed the Belt and Road Initiative with the Chinese ambassador here in Jamaica. When do you, Prime Minister, when can we anticipate that the contents of that arrangement, far-reaching as it is, the contents of that arrangement, we're talking about the Belt and Road, Initiative.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
What's the point of order?
On a point of order.
Go ahead, Mr.
This
Warmington.
standing order makes it clear that we confine ourselves for the issue before the House. And he has not deviated to ask a question outside of what is before the House. That has nothing to do with memorandum with China. Okay? Mr. Speaker, I need you to guide. You cannot bring a third country in the issue. The member from Southeast sent and brought up a set of questions. Any question from any member must be directed to those particular questions. If he wants to ask a question, he needs to bring before the House his independent questions. Table before the House.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister mentioned the transparency of the foreign policy. And I was following up on that line of the transparency of the foreign policy by simply asking the Prime Minister whether and when the contents of the substance of the Belt and Road Initiative will be tabled in this House or in the Senate.
Mr. Hilton, as was mentioned by the Deputy House Leader, your question must be in relation to the matter before the House. And it is in my opinion that the question is not so related. Motions that may be given orally, motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice, motions relating to the sitting of the House, motions for leave to introduce bills, presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained, public business. Mr. Samuda. Mr. Clark.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. The bill, Mr. Speaker, before this Honourable House today seeks to validate and confirm all acts done in good faith by the National Contracts Commission in the performance of its functions pursuant to the mandate granted to the Commission under the Contractor General Act in the registration and classification of prospective contractors. The bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to validate those acts done commencing on February 11th, 1999 and ending on April 1st, 2019. Mr. Speaker, before conducting the clause-by-clause examination of the bill, I feel that it's important to give a brief background of the National Contracts Commission, which I'll refer to as the Commission, and the reasons we now consider the passing of this validation indemnity bill. The Commission was established pursuant to the Contractor General Act by way of an amendment that was made to the Act in January 1999. It is important to note here, Mr. Speaker, that the Contractor General Act was substantially repealed by the Integrity Commission Act of 2017, but that sections of the Contractor General Act which related to the National Contracts Commission remained and were renamed the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act. Under the Contractor General Act, Mr. Speaker, the Commission was charged with the responsibility of carrying out certain functions in order to give effect to the principal objects of the Commission, namely the promotion of efficiency in the process of award and implementation of government contracts and ensuring transparency and equity. The functions of the Commission, Mr. Speaker, included, among other things, registering contractors and classifying such contractors according to the level and scope of the government contracts to which their registration applied, as the Act provided that any person, firm, or entity desirous of being registered and classified may apply to the Commission in the prescribed manner for such registration and classification. Further, Mr. Speaker, the Contractor General Act also stated that if the Commission is satisfied that an applicant meets the prescribed requirements, it may issue to that applicant a certificate of registration and classification in the prescribed form. The Contractor General Act also provided that fees might be charged for services rendered by the Commission pursuant to the Act, and stipulated that the charging of such fees was subject to the approval of Cabinet. And so, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate the manner and form in which these functions were to be carried out, the Portfolio Minister was empowered under the Act to make regulations, essentially to provide for any matter in respect of which such regulations might have been considered necessary or desirable for the better carrying into effect of provisions of the Act. Such regulations were to provide for any matter required by the Act to be prescribed. In other words, Mr. Speaker, regulations ought to have been made to prescribe the form and manner in which such applications should have been made, the form in which certification of such registration and classification should have been done, as well as the requirements for the manner, the requirements for and the manner of charging and collecting of fees by the National Contracts Commission in the performance of its functions under the Contractor General Act. Mr. Speaker, such regulations were not made, and the Commission, in an effort to meet its mandate, began to register and classify prospective contractors and to charge and collect fees for these activities, albeit in the absence of statutory authority. It is for this reason, Mr. Speaker, that we now seek to confirm and validate the acts undertaken by the National Contracts Commission during the 20-year period, February 11, 1999, and ending on April 1, 2019. On that note, Mr. Speaker, I wish to point out that with the coming into force of the Public Procurement Act 2015 on April 1, 2019, the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act 2017, which I mentioned earlier, has now been repealed and the National Contracts Commission now ceases to exist. It is, however, important and necessary, Mr. Speaker, to validate and confirm the actions of the National Contracts Commission and those persons who acted in support of the Commission in performing in good faith the functions which were set forth under the Contractor General Act and then after its amendment by the Integrity Commission Act under the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act of 2017 in the registration and classification of suppliers as well as in the charging and collection of fees. Mr. Speaker, it is also important to note that with the termination of the existence of the National Contracts Commission as of April 1, 2019, a new commission named the Public Procurement Commission has been established pursuant to the Public Procurement Act 2015, which, as I mentioned before, was brought into force on April 1, 2019. Mr. Speaker, I'll now like to go through the bill clause by clause, and you'll note that it is a short bill, and I hope the process will be relatively brief. Mr. Speaker, I would just like to draw members' attention to the long title as it encapsulates the purpose of the bill. The long title states that it is an act to validate and confirm all acts in relation to the registration and classification of prospective contractors, including the charging of fees done in good faith and inadvertent as to the absence of statutory authority by the National Contracts Commission and other persons in the exercise of its functions in purported fulfillment of its principal objects during the period commencing February 11, 1999 and ending on the day appointed for the coming into operation of the Public Procurement Act 2015, to indemnify persons against liability arising out of their carrying out of such acts and for connected matters. Mr. Speaker, this very long title will fall away once the bill is passed and receives the Governor General's assent. Mr. Speaker, the members will note that the preamble, which commences on page 1 with the word whereas and ends on page 3, sets out the state of facts that constitute the mischief which the bill is designed to remedy, and in so doing, Mr. Speaker, also sets out the historical background of the actions of the National Contracts Commission as it relates to the registration and classification of prospective contractors and the charging of fees. The preamble also sets out the state of affairs that now exist in relation to the amendment of the Contractor General Act by the Integrity Commission Act in 2017 and the repeal of the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act by the Public Procurement Act 2015, when the latter act was brought into force on April 1st, 2019. Mr. Speaker, Clause 1 establishes the short title of the bill, that is the National Contracts Commission Validation and Indemnity Act 2019, by which the act may be referred or cited. Mr. Speaker, Clause 2 is the interpretation clause of the bill and provides an interpretation of the term validation period, which is the period to which the bill applies. This period is stated to be the period commencing on February 11, 1999 and ended on the appointment day appointed for the coming into operation of the Public Procurement Act 2015. And Mr. Speaker, we know that the Public Procurement Act was brought into force on April 1st, 2019. This would therefore be the end of the validation period. The bill is therefore retrospective in nature, Mr. Speaker. Subclause 1 of Clause 3, Mr. Speaker, sets out the validating provisions of the bill and specifically declares that all acts referred to in Subclause 2, which were done in good faith and inadvertent as to their being without statutory authority during the validation period by the National Contracts Commission and by other persons acting in support of the Commission, were validly, properly, and lawfully done. Subclause 2, Mr. Speaker, specifies the acts which were done and which are to be validated by this bill. Mr. Speaker, this Honourable House will note that the acts being validated are those done in the purported exercise of the functions conferred upon the Commission in relation to the registration and classification of prospective contractors under the Contractor General Act and the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act of 2017, including the charging and subsequent collection of fees for the services of the Commission in respect of the registration and classification of prospective contractors. Mr. Speaker, Subclause 3 sets out the indemnification provision of the bill and frees, acquits, discharges, and indemnifies from liability every person who may be liable to be proceeded against for having carried out acts referred to in Subclause 2 and which were done by the National Contracts Commission and persons acting in support of the Commission in the performance of their functions, but inadvertent as to their being without statutory authority. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons provides an overview of the contents of the bill and, in effect, Mr. Speaker, states the policy that guided the preparation of the bill, that is to validate and confirm the acts of the National Contracts Commission and all other persons acting in connection with or in support of the Commission, done in relation to the registration and classification of prospective contractors, contrary to the provisions of the Contractor General Act and the National Contracts Commission Interim Provisions Act of 2017. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, the passing of this bill, entitled the National Contracts Commission Validation and Indemnity Act 2019, is critical, and I therefore seek the support of members of this House in passing this bill, subject to any amendments made here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
Mr. Goley.
We on this side have no objection to this bill. It's unfortunately one of many that have come to Parliament over the years, essentially correcting oversights in the administration of government affairs, perhaps indicating a lack of attention to detail from time to time. Indeed, it's perhaps ironic that an entity like the former National Contracts Commission, that was so assiduous in its unrelenting is the word preferred by my colleague across the aisle, in ensuring that would-be contracting parties meet all of the details of the registration requirements, and indeed deregistered some from time to time for not doing so, causing those persons, in some instances, significant economic fallout. The irony is that they, the Commission, were not in fact operating in accordance with due authorization of law, not having put or assured that the necessary arrangements, instruments, statutory instruments were in place to authorize the charging of fees, the utilization of forms and the like. Anyway, fortunately, Parliament has sufficient sovereignty to be able to cure such ills rather than have the public purse suffer from unbudgeted calls for refunds of monies collected over years. The amounts in this instance, I don't know how significant they are. There are other instances where they're even more significant. I know that it is something that from time to time persons query whether the retroactive validation of things that were not lawful before and acts done pursuant thereto is within the Constitution. But the truth is that the implications, if you were to aggregate all of the amounts over the years that have been collected, whether it be duties or cesses or fees or whatever, pursuant to non-existent regulations, the state could never absorb the cost of paying those back. So I think the capacity of Parliament to rectify these things is very important, although of course we should strive to improve our performance going forward so that we no longer have to have this kind of validating legislation coming to the Parliament from time to time. The Minister shared with me as a few more, and I'm not surprised, but we hope that we will get there over time. So we support the bill. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to... Well, okay, all right.
Mr. Speaker, I called for a second reading of the bill.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm All Acts in Relation to the Registration and Classification of Prospective Contractors, including the charges of fee done in good faith and inadvertent as to the absence of statutory authority by the National Contracts Commission and other persons in the exercise of its function, in purported fulfillment of its principal objects during the period commencing on February 11, 1999, and ending on the day appointed for the coming into operation of the Public Procurement Act 2015, to indemnify persons against liability arising out of their carrying out of such acts, and for connected matters, read a second time.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause.
clauses and then you have to put the parameter. Put them one, sure.
Members, I'll now put clause 1. Those in favor? Those against?
Chairman, I'd like to move that all clauses be put en bloc, including the title and the memorandum of objection reason. I'd like to propose that.
Okay. I put clauses 1 to 3. Those in favor? I put the preamble. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I put the title and then enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read for a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
A bill entitled an act to validate and confirm all acts in relation to the registration and classification of prospective contractors, including the charging of fees done in good faith and inadvertent as to the absence of statutory authority by the National Contracts Commission and other persons in the exercise of its functions in purported fulfillment of its principal objectives during the period commencing on February 11, 1999 and ending on the day appointed for the coming into operation of the Public Procurement Act 2015 to indemnify persons against liability arising out of their carrying out of such acts and for connected matters, read a third time and pass.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I seek recommittal of notices of motion given orally to enable the Minister of Finance to deal with the regulations on the public procurement classification and regulations of suppliers regulations bill.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Notice of motion given orally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. The Public Procurement Act, the Public Procurement Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulations Resolution 2019. Whereas by virtue of Section 61, subsection 1 of the Public Procurement Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Public Procurement Commission may, with the approval of the Minister, make regulations prescribing A, the evaluation criteria or qualifications required for the registration and classification of suppliers, B, the circumstances in which registration under the Act may be modified, suspended, cancelled, approved, or withdrawn, and the procedures for such modification, suspension, cancellation, or withdrawal of approval, C, the content and form of registers and other records to be maintained by the Commission, the availability of such registers for inspection, the production of copies as extracts therefrom, and any other matter relating to the establishment, maintenance, and safeguarding of registers and other records. D, forms, fees, and procedures for the registration or classification of suppliers. And whereas on the Commission and whereas on a previous sitting of the House in April 2019, the Commission, with the approval of the Minister, made the Public Procurement Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulation 2019 and whereas it is provided by Section 61, subsection 2 of the Act that regulations made under Section 61, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I should have, if I could reread this part. And whereas on the 30th day of April, that should be the date, 2019, the Commission, with the approval of the Minister, made the Public Procurement, Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulations 2019. And whereas it is provided by Section 61, subsection 2 of the Act that regulations made under Section 61, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. This resolution may be cited as a Public Procurement, Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulation Resolution 2019, and 2, the Public Procurement, Registration and Classification of Suppliers Regulations 2019, which were laid on the table of the House on the 30th day of April 2019, are hereby affirmed.
House Leader.
I now invite you to call on the Minister of Tourism to make his contribution to the sectoral debate. And it is regrettable that he is starting at 3:53. I remind the member that the limits is 1 hour and 3/4 of an hour, but consistent with our recent practices, we will give him additional time to complete his presentation, so long as it does not exceed 1 hour in totality.
Before you speak, Minister Bartlett, I just want to inform members in the gallery that you ought not to participate by clapping or any other form of participation. You may listen and sit attentively and listen to the proceedings. Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on this, my 30th occasion in this House, to address this Honourable House in a sectoral debate, so I demand some seniority. Mr. Speaker, I speak to the direction and development of one of our nation's foremost sectors, driving economic growth and job creation. It is an even greater honor, Mr. Speaker, to do so as this administration, ably and competently led by our dynamic Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, moves with speed to address the heavy weight of challenges inherited and stay resolute in our growth and prosperity agenda. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Almighty God for his constant guidance over these many years. My constituents of East Central St. James, the tourism sector, the JHTA, and all the members and stakeholders who have worked so assiduously with us to create the outcomes that we will speak of today and the future. My dear wife of 45 years, Carmen, my son and grandchildren, Mr. Speaker, to my constituents of East Central St. James, I want to say a special thanks and to comment a little bit on your support and patience in my continued leadership of your affairs. I'm absolutely delighted about the range of projects being instituted that will see improved roads, greater access to water, a deepening of community development and engagement activities, especially for our youth, housing development, urban renewal, effective development in agricultural projects, improved sports development initiatives, stronger avenues for job creation, and most important, Mr. Speaker, the relentless fight against the scourge of crime and violence that must be a collective fight, not just by the government on this side, but on each and every member of our society. Mr. Speaker, I salute my 3 councillors, my management team, and my dedicated and committed workers, including Ed's Tulips, and a number of the Tulips are here. And these are the ladies in the constituency who take care of the poor and the indigent. And they have enabled me to be the longest serving member of parliament for East Central St. James. 17 years this year. And when added to the 13 in East St. Andrew, you see where the 30 years are. The Human Capital Development Program, Mr. Speaker, of East Central St. James remain our flagship activity for the last 20 years. And we are proud, Mr. Speaker, that we have graduates from every single university locally and a number overseas, every teacher's college in Jamaica, and every high school in Jamaica from the scholarship program of East Central St. James. And we are proud of that. Mr. Speaker, I would like, of course, to thank the private sector and partners who have helped to make these scholarships sustainable over the years. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me in the generalities of my appreciation to not mention specifically my permanent secretary, who has been with me now. This is the 8th year that she is permanent secretary under my watch. And I'm also proud that she's a newly minted commander of the Order of Distinction, Jennifer Griffith. The board members and the chairman of my various boards, and indeed the executive directors and the entire governance of the ministry, who, Mr. Speaker, over the years have enabled us to roll out a range of policies, programs, and initiatives that have contributed significantly to the now booming sector. Mr. Speaker, I must acknowledge your steady hand of leadership of the House, and I know that the other speaker, the speaker who I should have addressed today, I would have had some comments further to make about him, because we are journeymen together, and perhaps he, along with me, would have been the longest serving cabinet ministers on this side. And I want to pay tribute to Colonel Charles, the Speaker, whilst recognizing the Speaker pro tem. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleagues on both sides of the House, and particularly my colleagues on the other side, and specifically to refer to the spokesman on tourism and former Minister Dr. Kenneth McNeil, who, Dr. Wickham, he's Kenneth also. He's Wickham Kenneth, who is not here today, but who has spoken to me and indicated that he would really have loved to be here, but he had to go and bury his brother who passed, and we offered our condolences, and we understand why he's not here. But I will have a comment to make about him at a later point in the presentation. Mr. Speaker, around the world today, tourism processes, tools, structures, systems, and actors are being radically reviewed, reorganized, and remade. In other words, Mr. Speaker, tourism is being reimagined. I dare say, Mr. Speaker, that Jamaica has played her part and is playing her part in this tourism reimagine exercise through a series of international conferences that we have had over the last 3 years, successful conferences, as you know. And Mr. Speaker, the essence, therefore, of this my presentation today will be to put in context the tool sets in play to reimagine this sector that is constantly in evolution. As we always say, The only constant in tourism is change. Mr. Speaker, I will therefore discuss issues relating to the strengthening of linkages, promulgating human capital development, piloting the largest wave of product expansion in the history of Jamaica, enhancing the use of technology and the Internet of Things, effecting a more comprehensive destination assurance program, improving private and public sector stakeholder collaboration, and incorporating innovation in the reimagining of our destination. And these are the areas, Mr. Speaker, that we will try to cover in this discourse for the next 45 minutes or so. Mr. Speaker, tourism has become a mega global industry. The UNWTO indicates that last year 1.4 billion people traversed the globe and spent $1.3 trillion in search of tourism experiences. The WTTC, which is the World Travel and Tourism Council, Mr. Speaker, in their analysis, and they are the standard bearer for tourism statistics, indicate that tourism and travel represents 10.4% of global GDP. And 1 in 10 jobs across the world is attributed to tourism. A total of 390 million people are employed in this industry. In addition, Mr. Speaker, some $882.4 billion, or 4.5% of the total investments in the world is related to tourism. Here in the Caribbean, Mr. Speaker, last year we welcomed 29.9 million international visitors and earned just about $30.8 billion. And that represents, Mr. Speaker, for most of the 28 countries of the Caribbean who are tourism-driven, some 40% of their GDP. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, 1 in 5 of all the workers in the Caribbean are engaged in tourism. The region expects a growth this year of 6%, and we'll discuss that against our own benchmarks a little later on. Here in Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, we achieved record growth in the last 3 consecutive years, surpassing our aspirational average growth of 5% per annum. You recall my 5 by 5 by 5. Last year, we welcomed 4.32 million visitors who spent $3.3 billion, representing 8.6% increase over the period 2017. Mr. Speaker, so far this year, this is the best winter Jamaica has ever seen in its history. In the first 4 months of the year, Mr. Speaker, and we have had double-digit growth every single month from January to April as we sit. We have welcomed 1.7 million visitors in 4 months in Jamaica who have spent $1.25 billion. And Mr. Speaker, that performance is against the background that in the period 2012, 13, 14, and 15, Jamaica experienced an increment of growth of just about 120,000. In 4 months, indeed in 3 months and 1 day, we have surpassed the 120,000 additional visitors who arrive in the country. And when you consider, Mr. Speaker, that it took us 40 years to make the first billion in tourism and 17 years to make the second, it is a tremendous performance on the part of all of us in Jamaica that in 3 months and 1 day, we surpassed $1 billion. Mr. Speaker, the growth that we mentioned, however, we have to also put in context in relation to the economic impact that it has had on the country. And the measurement, Mr. Speaker, is in terms of the impact on GDP. Because a lot of times the question is put that tourism Yes, you are announcing big numbers, but what is the impact on the economy itself? Well, Mr. Speaker, the truth is that in the last 3 years, the growth of tourism's impact on the GDP has moved by 12.7%. In 1 year alone, last year, it moved by 7.1%. Starting, for example, when I became minister at 7.8% of GDP and 2017, not 18 yet, because we don't have the figures for those as yet. At 2017, it was 9% of GDP. What that means, Mr. Speaker, in real monetary terms, is that some $171 billion of tourism contribution, or 16.2% of the GDP, is applicable there. But if we should look indeed at the broader picture of tourism expenditure overall, that is the $3 billion that we brought in 2017, calculating that in Jamaican dollars, that would amount to $431 billion US dollars, or 16.8% increase over the previous year, translating into 22.7% of GDP overall. JAMPRO indicates, Mr. Speaker, that foreign direct investment in 2017, tourism generated $173.1 million, or 19.5% of the total foreign direct investment into Jamaica. But, Mr. Speaker, the 121,000 employed workers, which is 9% of the workforce, directly and indirectly is 354,000 jobs and workers, representing 29.8% of GDP. Well, Mr. Speaker, the best figures to indicate to you the impact that tourism has on the economy is in the retention of the dollar. Because people say that tourism does have the propensity for leakage. And it's true. And destinations all over the world struggle to ensure that retention because that's where the wealth is. That's how the inclusiveness of tourism impacts communities and change lives and improve and enable prosperity. Well, when we began, Mr. Speaker, and we established our KPIs, we made it very clear that Jamaica's position of a retention of 30 cents was not acceptable. And that over the period of the 5 years, not 3 years we have gone, we are going to move that retention from 30 cents to 40 cents. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that the World Travel and Tourism Council, in their analysis, send the figures to us that Jamaica has now 40.8 cents in the dollar retained here. And that, Mr. Speaker, represents a 36% increase over the period. And we are proud of that because what that retention tells us is that the direct policy programs and the strategies that we have been following in the ministry to build linkages and to eliminate leakages is working and is working well. And Mr. Speaker, just to let you know that we are planning to strengthen that. And part of the discussion, therefore, Mr. Speaker, is going to be about strengthening linkages. And those of you who looked outside at the display that we had indicated to you what these linkages areas are and how the successes have been in those areas. And we have some goodies in a bag that we will give to you later on, which will help to even give you a better sense of what that is. So, led by hotelier Adam Stewart, the Jamaica Tourism Linkage Council established, as you know, the 5 networks: gastronomy, health and wellness, sports, and entertainment, knowledge and shopping. And this was done in collaboration with the Ministry of Industry and Commerce and Agriculture and Fisheries, the Ministry of Culture, and Gender and Entertainment and all those wonderful things, the Ministry of Education in particular, and of course the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Labor and Employment. And we developed these programs, Mr. Speaker, to build the capacity of our average Jamaican to tap into the rich and viable and elongated tourism value chain. So, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that visitors come to Jamaica to consume the cultural assets of the country, whether it be manufactured goods, cultural products, entertainment, or services. The ability, therefore, of the country to provide these through local and indigenous processes determine the wealth that we gain from the sector. The food the visitor eats, the bed they sleep in, the furniture they use, and the transportation and other services they access are all part of their consumption patterns. For example, Mr. Speaker, we spend the time to do the measurement of the demand that tourism has in the economy. And I just give you two numbers which indicates the extent of that demand. For agriculture, for example, Mr. Speaker, we have a demand for agricultural products of 39.6 billion Jamaican dollars. And on the manufacturing side, $352 billion. What that invites us to do is to examine how do we invest in these key supply side activities so as to enable that stronger retention of the dollar in our destination. So, Mr. Speaker, we made a conscious effort to produce against these demands and to sensitize the sector to support local suppliers. I've had several meetings with our hoteliers and our investors in this regard, and they have shown a response that is most encouraging, and indeed in some cases are looking at how they can work with local suppliers in order to enhance their capacity to produce the standard quality, price points, and reliability of supplies that are required. So in collaboration with the Rural Agriculture Development Authority, RADA, and the Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association, who are part of the Linkage Council, we proceeded to develop a raft of initiatives to encourage more local production, especially suppliers and buyers together in the sector. Mr. Speaker, we had successful speed networking events. We established farmers market and created a suppliers directory with a list of hundreds of local suppliers. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we established several applications through technology, not just for farmers, but for foodies and entertainment goers. Mr. Speaker, we created the Taste of Jamaica mobile app, the microsite which connects persons from everywhere in the world with local food hotspots, culinary trails, and food-focused events. And I just want to indicate quickly, Mr. Speaker, that out of that, people like the Pudding Man in Prairie was connected to buyers all over the world, and some of our all-inclusive actually cut big checks to him because he had sold his pudding online long before the visitors come to Jamaica. And just to speak, Mr. Speaker, we just launched the Top Events Jamaica designed to increase visitor participation events and activities island-wide. Strategic partnerships we have established, Mr. Speaker, to leverage the power of technology, social media, and advertising. And Mr. Speaker, Minister Audley Shaw and myself, a few months ago, launched the Tourism Agro-Linkages Exchange pilot project. We call it ALEX. And what Alex did was to assist 400 local farmers with marketing approximately 360,000 kilo of agricultural produce, costing somewhere in the region of $39 million, Mr. Speaker. The mandate of this initiative is to increase by 20% the number of farmers having continuous trade relationships with hotels, and to decrease by 15% the imports of fresh produce to the hotels and tourism entities. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, we have looked at how we can finance the activities of our small and medium enterprises to enable them to tap into the value chain. And so we provided $1 billion for a revolving loan scheme at the Exim Bank at the ridiculously low interest rate of 4.5%. The loan currently supports entities with at least 35% of its revenue derived from tourism and is offered at a maximum of $25 million per time and a minimum of 5 million Jamaican dollars. That interest rate, Mr. Speaker, is tenable there for tourism entrepreneurs primarily, and the repayable period is 5 years. Mr. Speaker, so far the report is very astonishing. Exim received up to November last year 51 completed loan applications totaling 941 million Jamaican dollars. And this, Mr. Speaker, is fantastic. So far, what we are saying is that they have on lend 750 million Jamaican dollars to over 35 entities across Jamaica. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, at the recently concluding Small and Medium Tourism Enterprise Summit that we had in Montego Bay, we had a program with Jamaica National for a small transportation entity for $100 million. We have increased that to $200 million so that more of our small transport providers can have funding now up to $4 million, up from the 3 that it was at the same rate of 5% over 5 years so that they can spruce up their enterprise. Mr. Speaker, the next important discussion today is our human capital development strategy. Overall, Mr. Speaker, our most iconic attraction is our people. And they represent the driving force behind our continued success. And we recognize that to remain top of mind in the market and maintain our competitive advantage, we must build our human capital by training and certifying them so as to increase their stackable credentials. Mr. Speaker, we have run the gamut from high school through the tourism sector worker and now in the realm of graduate studies. Mr. Speaker, last year we launched the first ever hospitality tourism management program, and I just want to say this, that this is in the high schools. First time in our history that the senior levels, what would be in the old time 6A and 6B, the Cape, 33 schools across Jamaica, 650 students enrolled in September, and they will graduate in 2020, Mr. Speaker, with an associate degree in hotel management and customer service. I'm pleased to say that a number of them are here from Spot Valley and a few other institutions that are represented here in the gallery. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that now our high school students will have an opportunity to have certification for entry level into the tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, we went further, and in 2017 we launched the Jamaica Center for Tourism Innovation, which is a pathway professional certification for the sector. The mandate of it, Mr. Speaker, is to identify competent workers, and I want us to listen to this carefully, is to identify competent workers in the industry who are not certified. That is a good cook, that we call the chef, but he's been working for 30 years and 20 years as a competent chef, but he's not certified, so he can't become a sous chef. And this, Mr. Speaker, we were able to bring them into the frame of the American Hotel and Lodging Institute so that they can have a degree designation and the American Culinary Foundation. That means that our workers, Mr. Speaker, will now be certified to present their credentials anywhere in the world and be recognized and given the proof. Mr. Speaker, we have a program to train 8,000 tourism workers over the next 5 years. But Mr. Speaker, if that were enough, we went further, Mr. Speaker, and we made the point that the business of professionalizing the industry cannot stop simply with certification, because tourism continues to evolve, as we say, and the future of work has to be examined and looked at. And so, Mr. Speaker, we went to the University of the West Indies, and we said to them we want a graduate program in tourism for innovation and development. So, Mr. Speaker, I want you to just give me a minute to make this point because it is so important to us. While I am happy, Mr. Speaker, that we've been able to facilitate skill development in many of the traditional areas, I am strongly of the view that the focus of talent development must extend beyond traditional areas and now consider the emerging skill requirements of an increasingly differentiated and segmented tourism sector. We recognize that even though tourism is a highly labor-intensive sector, the majority of the tourism-related jobs available are deemed to require low to medium-level technical skills and tend to offer relatively limited prospects for economic mobility. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, the sector may not be viewed as attractive for a large number of people seeking high-skilled jobs. The future of tourism lies in the manipulation of and exploitation of the information and technology industry. Capabilities such as big data, data analytics, blockchain technologies, the Internet of Things, robotics, etc., are therefore urgently needed, Mr. Speaker, to capitalize on the highly skilled employment that are being generated by the ICT-related fields in tourism. And Mr. Speaker, just to let you know that I went to Nara in Japan, where we see that the new trend in tourism is now robotics, where Alex and Alexis are defining the experience from you go to be made a traveler until your experiences are done. So when you do your flight arrangements, Alex takes over and carries you through to your bedroom, define the temperature in your room, identify what threads your sheet has, and also identify the food types that you want, and before you know it is done. But the thing about Alex is that Alex has to be directed by a mind. And our job is to build that mind so that Alex can be directed. And that is what we're about. So, Mr. Speaker, the evolving tourism market will also require modern managerial skills that can drive performance improvement in sectors by raising productivity through better staff planning and scheduling, employing new technology, and improving employee motivation, thereby reducing staff turnover. Mr. Speaker, I strongly believe that a robust institutional framework is therefore needed to determine the education and training policies and programs that will support a more attractive labor market and business environment in tourism, which will allow the industry to maintain a sufficient and high qualified workforce and hence support the enhancement of productivity. For my part, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to identify the relevant skill sets needed to fill jobs in the evolving tourism sector with the anticipation that these skill sets will be translated into curricula that can be implemented as professional higher education programs by tertiary institutions in Jamaica. It is within this context, Mr. Speaker, that I made a pitch to the University of the West Indies, and I'm proud to tell you that in 2020, the university will launch its first ever graduate school in tourism in the Western campus in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, we are doing this level of human capital development, and I want us to listen to this, particularly the leader of the opposition, because he's concerned about the labor market arrangements in tourism. We are doing this level of human capital development to influence the labor market arrangements within the sector by professionalizing the sector and creating a cadre of workers that are qualified, certified, and can be classified. Mr. Speaker, workers will now be able to attract remuneration based on their certification, and this is the surest way of securing tenure. Mr. Speaker, we hereby give notice in this House that the short-term contractual arrangement will be coming to an end, and we'll be working with the Ministry of Labour and the sector overall to ensure that this happens in short order. Another vexed issue, Mr. Speaker, a contentious one, is the question of the social security of our workers. Today, Mr. Speaker, the long-awaited tourism workers' pension bill has been tabled. And this is a game changer, Mr. Speaker, for the workers, and represent not just a historic development in the Caribbean, but in the world. Because, Mr. Speaker, this will become the only destination in the world that has a comprehensive pension plan for every single worker in the sector called tourism. This will make us, Mr. Speaker, a world leader in providing tourism social security. Already, Mr. Speaker, we have been getting inquiries from other nations about our revolutionary pension plan. The commitment, Mr. Speaker, to this pension plan began in 2008. And I want to tell you that, and became a manifesto prescription by the then Bruce Golding administration. It came about because in December, every year we go and have breakfast with the Red Caps and with the immigration workers and the airport staff in general. And I went to Norman Manley, Mr. Speaker, and I saw this red cap. He was 78 years old. And he had been doing the job for 48 years. And I said to him, why are you still out here? He told me about his children and grandchildren and so on. And he said to me, I can't leave because if I leave here, I will not have anything to eat afterwards. And I resolved in my mind then that we must have a pension plan for the workers of the tourism industry. And so we began the work. We began the work with permanent secretary, Griffiths. See her over there. We started the work together. And Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to the minister who came after me, Wickham McNeil, who continued the work while I was on sabbatical. But Mr. Speaker, as usual, the work which we began, we have to end. It's poetic justice. And so it is poetic justice that I should be the one to finally have this bill consummated. I want to pay tribute also, Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Daisy Coke and the committee that worked so assiduously hard on it. The Jamaica Hotel and Tourist Association, the Parliamentary Council, the Office of the Parliamentary Council, the Financial Services Commission, and the Legislative Committee, Mr. Speaker, who spent 3 long days and nights on the 120 clauses of this first groundbreaking, historic workers' pension plan. Mr. Speaker, this is a defined contributory plan supported by legislation, and it's the first of its kind, and will require mandatory contribution by workers and employees. The plan will cover all workers, all workers aged 18 to 59 years in the tourism sector, whether permanent, contract, or self-employed. Benefits, Mr. Speaker, will be payable at the age of 65 years and older. Initially, Mr. Speaker, for the first 2 years, the contribution will be 3% of gross salary to be matched by the employer, and thereafter 5% matched on both sides. Mr. Speaker, the ministry is providing $1 billion to seed the fund so that the immediate benefits can accrue to qualified pensioners who have met the vested period of 5 years. And this, Mr. Speaker, is an enormously powerful social tool that this government has put together to ensure that those who have suffered over the many years in the industry without a benefit can now have an opportunity to start within 5 years of being a member. Mr. Speaker, the pensioner will receive a minimum pension of $200,000 Jamaican per year. Pension plan, Mr. Speaker, embraces everyone in the sector, whether he or she, be red cap, front desk manager, craft trader, housekeeper, raftsman from the Rio Grande or from a Great River, musician, or any category of worker in the industry, including, Mr. Speaker, those who are self-employed. So the taxi man and the juta man and the jackal man and all the ground transportation people will now have an opportunity to be part, Mr. Speaker, of arguably what is the biggest human capital development related game changer in the history of tourism in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I remain strongly committed to improving the welfare of the thousands of hotel workers across the island. The housing condition of hotel workers is of particular concern to me. Mr. Speaker, I point to a recent survey that indicated that 88% of the workers in the sector cannot even access NHT housing solutions. Mr. Speaker, we have searched long and hard for a formula that can provide affordable housing for our workers, and we are proud of the policy shift that the Prime Minister has announced with regards to the NHT menu of benefits, which will see, Mr. Speaker, an increase in the loan limits, reduce interest rates on NHT mortgage, intergenerational mortgages, and increase in construction loan limit for the NHT lots. Mr. Speaker, in 2009, the Tourism Enhancement Fund, along with the Housing Agency of Jamaica, earmarked $1 billion Jamaican dollars for upgrading housing solutions for tourism workers. Among the things that were done, Mr. Speaker, was the acquisition from FINSAC of 250 acres of land, which were handed over to the HAJ towards brownfield development and greenfield housing projects in Grange Pen in St. James. That program, Mr. Speaker, experienced a period of hiatus during my sabbatical. But, Mr. Speaker, we have now picked up back that program. And so recently, Mr. Speaker, we broke ground for the resort squatting settlement upgrade project at Grange Pen Brownfield. And, Mr. Speaker, the HAJ will oversee the infrastructural upgrade for the regularization of 535 households in the Grange Pen community. The general scope of the work includes the following: road scribing and paving, draining infrastructure, construction of a sewage treatment plant, water supply connections to NWC, electricity distribution, and land titling. In addition, Mr. Speaker, with the Chinese developer Henan 5 construction, we have, and the Prime Minister only last week, signed a JV to build 750 units in the Rhine Park area at a price point, Mr. Speaker, ranging from $7.9 million for a one-bedroom to $18 million for a three-bedroom. Ground will be broken in May for that development. And the greenfield development now of Grange Pen, Mr. Speaker, is currently out to tender. And that will see an additional 1,000 units, which will make a total of 1,700 units available to the tourism workers at the lowest possible price point in the market. This is a model, Mr. Speaker, that we want to take across the tourism belt. And the next one will be Whitehall in Negril, where the program had actually started during that same period and sort of suffered a little bit when I was on sabbatical. But it will come back again and will start, Mr. Speaker, next year. So, Mr. Speaker, we have done the work in relation to the human capital development strategies that will enable the workers of the tourism industry to become streamlined and mainstreamed and given tenure. And so those who are concerned about tenure in tourism and the workers of the industry, see it there? It's there now. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Tourist Board now has a fully integrated website that will transform its marketing strategies. Visit jamaica.com now forms part of JTB's overall strategy to compete in the ever-changing global marketplace, as well as its attempt to revolutionize its method of marketing and promoting Jamaica as a destination. This new digital platform hosts and promotes, Mr. Speaker, all aspects of the destination and provides real-time access and content to tour operators and travel agents globally to be more efficient in marketing Jamaica. This new digital platform, the most powerful and digitally advanced tourism website in the entire region, I'm going to make that point, is being leveraged as a core component of the digital marketing stack and is our primary campaign call to action, and now offers the unique capabilities like dynamic content and geotargeting, which goes beyond traditional marketing to intelligently deliver relevant content to specific audiences. So we're not just marketing to the world, and that's why we're growing the way we are. We are being specific in terms of where we want to market and to whom we're going to be marketing. Integration with customer relationship management software to support website initiatives and partners' relationships. Also resources needed to plan a wedding, Mr. Speaker, and we are going after the Indian market because the wedding component there is huge. When they come in droves, yes, for Indian weddings. Events, Mr. Speaker, and meetings, we are booking all across the globe to make our convention center of the MICE arrangements. 6 language options, Mr. Speaker, we have on the platform. 6 languages. So you can talk to the Mandarin-driven Chinese. You can talk to the French Paris. Yes, you can talk to the Spanish in Madrid. You can talk to a number of other nationalities on the languages of their own because of the quality that we've brought on the platform. Mr. Speaker, we are connecting with Airbnb in a very special way, and I'll discuss that a little later on, because that data mine that we are now given access to will enable us to utilize big data in a more effective way and in a more defined way so that we can market more directly, and we can measure and manage our outcomes. And that is the essence of optimal utilization of scarce resources. Mr. Speaker, an important addition to our tourism product offering is our Montego Bay Convention Center, with its improved facilities and technological capabilities to drive meetings, incentives, conventions, and exhibitions. Already, Mr. Speaker, the Convention Center has become an important node in driving mega events into Jamaica. For example,
you can continue.
Thank you. Already, Mr. Speaker, the Convention Center has become an important node in
I think the House Leader.
My colleague, the Minister, can finish the point in any of the 15 minutes remaining.
All right.
So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member be allowed sufficient time to complete his presentation within the next 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leader.
Those against, as have it.
Thank you very much, House Leader and colleagues. For example, Mr. Speaker, we are about to host a mega convention from Petrobras in Brazil with over 1,000 delegates. And already, Mr. Speaker, we have hosted the successful UNWTO Global Conference on Job Creations with over 1,000 delegates, and the Caribbean and Tourism Marketplace with over 1,200 delegates. Mr. Speaker, these continued activities which position our convention center as a mega location for meetings and convention will augur well for our effort to ensure operational and financial efficiencies so that in short order the convention center could be self-sufficient. Mr. Speaker, we have reimagined Jamaica Vacations Limited to create greater capacity to respond to the growing demand of additional airlift into Jamaica as we continually expand deeper in legacy and new markets to secure better global connectivity and have added cruise tourism we have added cruise tourism to that portfolio. We are pleased to report that we have had and will continue to have a series of new flights into the island. And already, Mr. Speaker, for the winter, we had somewhere in the region of 1 million seats. And for this summer, Mr. Speaker, and I want to make this as an important point because this record-breaking winter that I just reported is now about to see another record-breaking summer because we have secured 1.4 million seats, the largest number of seats that we have ever had. And Mr. Speaker, of this amount, which is 8.4% more than last year, and of this amount we have 100,000 seats out of the United States of America where we are having the best growth ever. We grew from the United States by 20%, and that's phenomenal for the largest market that we have. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, new gateways are opening up, and the Thomas Cook between Manchester, the United Kingdom, Southwest Airlines, as well as Sun Country, and a number of other American carriers are now coming into the country. Mr. Speaker, cruise tourism will continue to become a staple part of the experiences of Jamaica. In collaboration with the Port Authority of Jamaica, we are looking at expansion of possibilities with our partners, as well as new port facilities and possibilities on the north and south coast. And our Prime Minister is particularly driven by developing more ports across Jamaica so that the benefits can accrue to more of the rural communities across Jamaica. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at possibilities for the north and south coast, the southeastern areas, including Kingston and Port Royal. Mr. Speaker, we are also in an advanced stage of discussions regarding employment in the cruise industry. So between 10 to 15,000 workers are being positioned to benefit from that exercise. The ministries of Labor and Social Security, Transport and Mining are working together with us to deal with the convention in relation to seafarers and hospitality workers in the cruise industry. Mr. Speaker, a recurring trend and challenge for the industry is the safety, security, and what is considered the overall seamlessness of our travelers. This is what we refer to broadly, Mr. Speaker, as destination assurance, and is a major selling point if we are to remain competitive. The discerning traveler today, Mr. Speaker, wants to be assured of safety, seamlessness, and security of a destination. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we have to employ very strong and determined and carefully considered security measures and policies, they are towards securing and maintaining the standard that Jamaica has had and the position that we have in the market as a safe, secure, and seamless destination. And so, Mr. Speaker, we remain committed not only to ensuring a safe and secure destination, but we must build resilience against disruptions and in the face of changes that are taking place. So through a robust destination assurance program managed by the TPDCO, we have been ramping up the efforts to reduce negative visitor experiences. Some of these initiatives, Mr. Speaker, include the Team Jamaica training and an anti-harassment campaign to change the mindset and behavior as it relates to visitor relations. Product development and community tourism, in addition, Mr. Speaker, to a licensing program to ensure that their standards are maintained. Tourism, Mr. Speaker, is moving to develop new architecture for visitor safety and security to respond to the changing culture of the travel and tourism sector. In particular, Mr. Speaker, relations between the traveler and the worker. Mr. Speaker, we have had a series of allegations with regards to inappropriate behavior involving guests and workers in the sector, and that is of great concern to us and for which we must act. And I just want to indicate that our most recent initiative by our ministry and the TPDCO is to do the island-wide security audit with support from the international security expert, Dr. Peter Tarlow. The audit is carrying out through evaluation now, Mr. Speaker, a thorough evaluation of the security vulnerabilities of hotels and attractions to uncover non-compliance, deficiencies, and irregularities, and to assist the operators of these business enterprises to enhance the quality of their existing security apparatus. To date, Mr. Speaker, 300 hotels and guest houses have been targeted for the audit, and 90 properties, or 30%, have been audited. The audit is scheduled to be completed by the end of June, at which time we'll roll out a new protocol on visitor safety and security. Mr. Speaker, the tourism industry is undergoing daily changes, and we have to respond to this in order to remain relevant, fashionable, and viable. This calls for innovation and the development of new systems, processes, and methodologies. The advent of a sharing economy as a major disruptor that gave rise to Airbnb, Uber, and a whole range of other disruptors are challenging the viability of our indigenous and traditional accommodation and transportation sector in particular. Mr. Speaker, the rapidly expanding Airbnb market received some 89,500 guests in 2018, a massive increase from 55,000 in 2017. With an average length of trip of approximately 5 days, a typical host in Jamaica earns a revenue of up to $2,600 in 2018. And this is a little man with a little room in the back of his house in Trenchtown and in Minnesota for Unicom. And Grantspen. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the growth of this segment, as within the appropriate regulatory framework, it will provide additional opportunities for ordinary Jamaican homeowners to generate new streams of income. Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the ground transportation subsector, who are represented here today, we are in conversation with local operators to craft an appropriate arrangement to improve efficiency and global competitiveness in the marketplace. The Tourism Worker Group, for which I will speak about later, Mr. Speaker, is currently reviewing this area to make appropriate recommendations in short order. Mr. Speaker, we have taken new and more imaginative examination of our existing products and future-proof them against the new global tourism marketplace. The new showcasing, Mr. Speaker, the new marketplace includes new demographics such as millennials, special needs travelers, as well as new emerging markets and cultures occasioned by evolving economic global patterns. We will require multifaceted and multi-stakeholder response by reimagining existing resort areas and creating new and diverse experiences. In this context, Mr. Speaker, I have appointed my permanent Secretary Jennifer Griffith to spearhead a high-level team of experienced and skilled public and private sector stakeholders to develop a comprehensive program for the reimagining of Destination Jamaica. The ball is already rolling, Mr. Speaker. We are working assiduously to develop new destinations in St. Thomas, and that detail we will have for you at a later point. Mr. Speaker, we are looking at reimagining Montego Bay, Negril, Port Antonio, and the areas on the South Coast, and definitely, Mr. Speaker, downtown Kingston, Ocho Rios, and Port Royal. Mr. Speaker, the effort is going, and the arrangements are currently in place. Mr. Speaker, our ability to establish a sustainable tourism sector in Jamaica will significantly depend on the effectiveness of strategies for promoting mitigation and enhancing the resilience against a range of dynamic threats. Mr. Speaker, threats that Jamaica must take seriously involve climate change, disaster degradation, and resilience. Over the next several years, Mr. Speaker, that warning has not fallen on deaf ears. And I'm proud to say that Jamaica is a world leader in driving the whole area of building capacity to deal with global disruptions. Last year, we established, Mr. Speaker, the first ever Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center at the University of the West Indies in Mona. The center will help, Mr. Speaker, vulnerable states against to recover quickly from global disruptions such as natural disasters, pandemics, terrorism, cybercrimes, economic and political disruptions, and so on. It will specifically target, Mr. Speaker, destination preparedness, management and recovery from disruptions and/or crises that threaten economies and livelihoods globally. with real-time data and effective communication. Mr. Speaker, our center will stand at the crossroads, and Jamaica will be at the epicenter of the new move to create innovation and to enable people to recover from global disruptions, thrive and thrive and thrive after those disruptions have come. Mr. Speaker, the chairman of this global entity is Dr. Talib Rifai, the former UNWTO, and he shares that position with yours truly. The honorary chair is our own Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, and he also shares that with the former President of Malta, Senora Louise Praker. And to date, we have, Mr. Speaker, a board of governors that covers all the continents of the world. And it's amazing to see how those people respond to Jamaica and who are excited by the fact that Jamaica is providing thought leadership in global tourism diplomacy. Mr. Speaker, the center positions Jamaica at the epicenter of tourism resilience and crisis management worldwide. Already, satellite centers are being positioned in the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, Africa, and a number of other engagements are coming to us as we are now scheduled, Mr. Speaker, to be in Nepal, South Africa, and Australia. We are proud of the fact that little Jamaica can present itself in this very powerful world position in the world community. Mr. Speaker, hotel rooms are booming. We are going to be building some 7,500 new rooms over the next 3 to 5 years. Mr. Speaker, we are working assiduously on building the experiences of our beaches across Jamaica. And already the TEF has spent over $200 million on improving various beaches like Mount Salem Beach, Markinstone Beach, License Beach, Boston Beach, and the preparations for the Winifred Beach, which is coming around the corner. A number of other beaches, Mr. Speaker, are coming to be. And Mr. Speaker, PAGI and all of those are on the program. But to enhance that process, I want you to listen because this relates to you. To enhance that program, Mr. Speaker, we have agreed that to build what we call creative placings across Jamaica, where unused, underutilized, and derelict structures can be converted into centers for tourism experiences. We are going to provide $300 million for 63 communities across Jamaica, given to each member of parliament $4 million for that program. So each MP will get $4 million to develop that experience. And I want to make the point, it is not going to be for putting up fences, nor bushing. It is going to be to create economic experiences that visitors and locals alike can come to and provide economic well-being for the people in the community. Mr. Speaker, the Tourism Working Group has done its work, and I expect that the report will come in short order so that we can use it to refashion, and this member understands what I'm talking about, and to reimagine the experiences across Jamaica. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the future of tourism in Jamaica looks extraordinarily promising. And our work over the last 3 years has illustrated to all that with effective vision, clear policy, proper planning, and bold action, you can achieve the targets of 5 by 5 by 5 at least. And Mr. Speaker, we are now to review our targets set 3 years ago, as our performance today indicates that we are on track to surpass those. And the Prime Minister has already given me new targets, and to say that 5 by 5 must morph into at least 6 by 4 by 10. Mr. Speaker, we have outlined to the country a strategy for reimagining our tourism sector to achieve a greater level of inclusive growth and prosperity for our people. We have built out a human capital development strategy that puts our tourism worker at the center of everything we do, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We have created the most historic tourism pension plan in the world, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on the training and certification of our tourism workers through the Jamaica Center for Tourism Innovation, which already hundreds of workers have been trained and another 8,000 to be done in the coming year, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We have delivered the hospitality and tourism training program in high schools, and now we are delivering on a graduate school of tourism being developed by the University of the West Indies, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on our commitment to housing of the tourism workers, with already over 1,700 new houses on the books, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on improving linkages in the tourism sector, with now a major increase in the tourism dollar staying in Jamaica, 40.8 cents of the dollar staying in Jamaica, thereby reimagining tourism for prosperity. Mr. Speaker, we are delivering on improving business arrangements between hoteliers and local suppliers, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on our $1 billion revolving loan program for the small and medium tourism enterprises and another $200 million for the small tourism enterprises at the transportation subsector, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on the slew of collaborations aimed at boosting Jamaica's businesses and individuals through entertainment, health and wellness, shopping, knowledge, gastronomy, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on record growth in new rooms, thereby with arrivals, Mr. Speaker, projected this year to be 4.8 million visitors and $4 billion earned, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on even more flights from all over the world. We are delivering, Mr. Speaker, a game changer of tourism, as you know it, as we become more democratized and spread the benefit of tourism all over Jamaica. Just look at Airbnb, Mr. Speaker. We are reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on developing public beaches to first world standards all across Jamaica for all Jamaicans, thereby reimagining tourism for growth and prosperity. We are delivering on the sprucing up and upgrading of our resort areas, Mr. Speaker, and our communities. We are delivering in providing, Mr. Speaker, an opportunity for 63 communities across Jamaica to benefit from economic development activities under the guidance of their Member of Parliament and the TPDCO. Mr. Speaker, tourism is ready to take off. Tourism reimagined, reinvigorated, re-inspired with clear policy, good vision, and action. Mr. Speaker, and Jamaica will achieve our objectives to convert and transform our industry and our people from poverty to prosperity.
Well done, boy. Well done, well done, well done, well done. Well done. Prosperity. Prosperity was said.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
The beach in Kelly.
My pause, Mr. Speaker, is to enable the members of the House. Is to enable the members of the House to digest a well-constructed and very, very well put together and presented speech by the Minister of Tourism, full of positive reaction to a year of great work, and we want to commend him for all that he has been doing. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is the lady's turn. And so we call on, or I invite you to call on the member from Southeast St. Anne to make her presentation.
Miss Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't mind, special class. Mr. Speaker, this year marks 12 years since I was an elected member of this House. Thanks entirely to the people of Southeast St. Anne, my constituency executive, my councillor, the heads of divisions, my personal staff, and the thousands of residents who continue to have faith in my ability and hope that I can represent them. Mr. Speaker, my political home is the People's National Party. It is where my heart is, and it is where it will be always. I give thanks to my colleagues on this side and the thousands of party supporters who continue to inspire me to unswervingly dedicate my life to the harsh vicissitudes of representational politics. I want to, in a very special way, thank the leader of my party and party president, the member from East Central St. Andrew, Dr. Peter Phillips, whose reasonings and musings and guidance have been invaluable to my political growth and my maturity over these last couple of years. To my colleagues on that side, I also express appreciation and gratitude for the wit and the candor in the political hustlings that this Parliament often gives to each other and to every one of us. To the Jamaican press, who have listened and covered my views on a range of issues, and the thousands who connect with me on a daily basis on Instagram and on Facebook and on Twitter, and every Jamaican here and abroad who encourage me to strive on their behalf, I want them all to know that I'm very grateful for their support. And to my two beloveds, my husband Richard, who can't be with us today, and my son Alexander, who is here. And I want in a very special way say how proud I am of my son Alex, who actually goes off to university this year. And I want to thank the colleagues on this side and those on that side who have supported me in being a dutiful parent in light of all the hardships that I have to go through and challenges as a member of Parliament. So I'm proud of you, Alex. I wish you well. My love for you is undying. And I hope, as you say, since you're studying political science and finance, that you actually find something else to do in your future. Mr. Speaker, foreign affairs and foreign trade interconnect with our everyday lives. From the most prosaic circumstances of every MP being bombarded daily by members of various places in our constituency for farm work cards, to complex Brexit, China Silk Road, and US-Venezuela relations, it all affects our every waking moment. A simple example is the impact of visa requirements on 81% of Jamaica's youth between 14 to 40 years of age, who available data suggests would leave Jamaica immediately if they could for perceived better circumstances and opportunities overseas. Foreign affairs, Mr. Speaker, is a pervasive, perennial companion whose daily intrusions into our national and personal lives are now more bewitching and nosy than Gladys Kravitz and more invasive than the mandatory NIDS. However, as a result of this government's missteps in foreign affairs, for the first time, Jamaica's international reputation for honourable decision-making has been brought into sharp scrutiny. At the OAS, CARICOM went in one direction and Jamaica another. We turned our back on a friend who supported us when we were in need, and at the UN, we were MIA when needed for a principled vote. So, Mr. Speaker, I've had numerous opportunities over the last year to speak on these issues and to speak about these new obsequious postures in international fora. So rather than revisit history and repeat myself at great length, Mr. Speaker, and it's not my MO to do that, I'll use this time to focus on foreign trade, which with the right policies provides the greatest opportunity for citizenry to improve their wealth and quality of life. For far too long, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's growth rate has been very slow. What we've been doing has not worked, and yet we still continue to pursue the problem the same way. Mr. Speaker, in October 2017, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade tabled what was called, and created, I should say, a national foreign affairs or a national trade policy. Page 2 of that document outlines, and I quote, the overall aim of Jamaica's trade policy is to increase exports in goods and services while managing the flow of imports in such a way that the economy benefits in a sustained manner. Specifically, it seeks to ensure that Jamaican firms obtain access to strategic markets under the most favorable conditions. The policy also seeks to create an enabling environment to allow firms to be more competitive, to make use of this access. For small economies like Jamaica, which cannot meet their needs from internal production and the domestic market, international trade is critical to their sustained economic growth and development. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, the policy paper goes even deeper on page 15, and I quote, at the national level, Jamaica's trade policy can be said to always have been export-led, even when the country introduced an import substitution policy in the 1950s. Good God, Mr. Speaker, that is a contradiction in terms. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to suggest that the contradiction in that statement is a major source of our poor export performance and economic growth over many years. In theory, Mr. Speaker, import substitution gives the producer a guaranteed local market with the expectation that he or she will use that market to become more efficient and then export. But in reality, this only creates monopolies that incentivize local producers to take advantage of the local market through higher prices while ignoring the export market. This only ensures that ordinary Jamaicans are driven further and further away from prosperity. This is why, over the last 50 years, Jamaicans' per capita income have grown marginally, while those in places like Singapore and Dubai have increased by multiples of 100. Their success lay in their vision of the world as their trading market. So what they do is that they facilitate their local businesses to trade with that market and not the other way around. The world today, Mr. Speaker, is radically different than it was in the 1950s. And we need to understand and have a new attitude designed for the success in that marketplace. What does the world look like, Mr. Speaker? Today, buyers and sellers don't have to interact with each other. I can stay right here in Parliament, talk to manufacturers in China, purchase my goods online and have them delivered right to my doorstep in Jamaica. I don't even have to step my foot in China. Technology and automation have taken over physical labor. Machines can produce 4 billion quart bottles of engine oil in Nigeria, Lagos, annually, using only 15 people to run the factory floor, and I've seen it myself. The machines that are now being used for automation can churn out billions annually. Global companies now dominate world trade and are merging to get bigger and more influential with a higher degree of specialization. Volkswagen has bought Audi and Porsche. A family business, a Brazilian family business, now owns Heinz, Kraft, Budweiser, Corona, Miller, and 397 other beer brands, including Banks Brewery in Barbados. That particular company, and it's a family-owned company in Brazil, has sales in excess of $100 billion US. That's 13 trillion Jamaican dollars. By comparison, Jamaica's GDP in 2016 was 14 billion. 14 billion, 1.28 trillion, 1/8 of that family business's sales, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, despite Jamaica's leadership in having the first refrigerated banana ship sailing from our shores to the UK in 1901, and the refrigerated container having been invented in 1930, our agricultural exports have not really changed over the last 100 years. Mr. Speaker, no country has ever created true wealth for its people without access to export markets, both in goods and in services. And Jamaica will never create true prosperity for our 3 million people by only selling to our 3 million people. It's not possible. Mr. Speaker, China's population of 1,300,000,000, more than 4 times the size of the United States of America. Our market of 3 million people certainly does nothing really in any meaningful way to advance the Chinese economy. But consider this, Mr. Speaker. If Jamaica just had one product, just one, and said we were going to now market to 5% of the Chinese population, 65 million people, one product to target 65 million purchasers at $20 US per product, per person, per annum, that would amount to $130 million US, or 17 trillion Jamaican dollars in annual sales. Mr. Speaker, in Beijing and Shanghai, there's a coffee shop on every corner. Globally, people consume 2.4 billion cups of coffee every day. So why not coffee in retail packaging? And why aren't we selling it to China online? Why, how is it, and why must we continue to sell beans instead of other finished goods and products? As leaders, we must facilitate the creation of value-added coffee products right here in Jamaica for export. And the Coffee Board must stop treating small coffee farmers like slaves and allow them to do their own foreign marketing and trade. Regulation and certification, yes. Suffocation, no, Mr. Speaker. And we must allow our coffee farmers to now take advantage of that market. Dubai's population at the time of Jamaica's independence, Mr. Speaker, was 47,000 people. Today it is 2.7 million people with a GDP of 120 billion, 6% of which comes from oil. The majority of their GDP comes from tourism, trade, and commerce. And by comparison, when Jamaica in 2016 exported 1.4 billion or 182 billion Jamaican dollars, Dubai non-oil exports, Mr. Speaker, was exporting $140 billion worth of goods and services. That is about 18.2 trillion Jamaican dollars. Our import substitution policy, which is broad-based and still being pursued today, is a dead-end road. So we have this policy in place since the 1950s, when the world was very, very different. Over the last 10 years, we consistently import 2 to 4 times more than we export. In 2017, it was 5.8 billion imported, and 1.3 billion US dollars exported. Can't do that trade imbalance, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica needs a radical mindset shift. We must begin to think of ourselves as a value-added export country. We also need to realize that we can't be all things to all people. We must focus on products through which we have a worldwide competitive advantage. To succeed in any one of them at just 1% market share of the world would transform Jamaica to the country we all say we want to live in and yearn to live in. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm here not to criticize, but to give recommendations. Here are some recommendations on how Jamaica can actually grow through exports. Music and art. If we were to ask a question, Mr. Speaker, what has music done for Jamaica? The answers would be unending. However, if I was to ask musicians, what has Jamaica done for them? The majority, if not all, would say not much. What have they done? They have done everything basically on their own. Recently in Kingston, I attended one of the most professionally organized and satisfying and gratifying musical performances, owned and managed by Jamaicans. Every hotel in Kingston was full. Every airline seat coming into Jamaica was booked. Mr. Speaker, if Buju Banton was listed as an export company, his shows alone in the last month in Jamaica, Nassau, Trinidad, and Barbados would put him in the top 20 Jamaican exports. Had he been a hotel or an export manufacturing entity, he would qualify for significant incentives and waivers. Neither he nor any other artist receives these kinds of incentives. Additionally, foreign entities coming to set up for shows can bring their technology and equipment to our shores duty-free because they're taking them back out. But our producers, sound engineers, lighting technicians, digital content providers, stage managers, artists have to pay the import duties, the GCT, and other charges for equipment purchased. If you understand the industry, Mr. Speaker, people aren't buying this equipment for the most part to sell it, but rather to enhance their talents and earning capacity. Whatever import tax revenue loss the country may suffer is minuscule compared to the potential earnings and pride and marketing these artists bring to Jamaica. How can we be satisfied that a potential drummer in my constituency of Southeast St. Ann or in West Rural St. Andrew can't afford the entry or the tools of trade, whether he wants to set up a makeshift studio at his house or her house and to properly develop his talents? Mr. Speaker, we have not designed this economy to properly develop and equip industry. Yet his artistry is already recognized as coming from a country that produces the world's best. So, Mr. Speaker, the technology for artist production is moving fast. A 3-year-old soundboard is almost obsolete today. And if you know what a soundboard is, I think the member from St. Catherine would know what a soundboard is. When you go into a studio and you're going to mix down the music, everything you know is computerized. So the soundboard checks everything. Those things are moving fast. The computer technology, everything. So as fast as they can bring it and do it, everything is changing. Therefore, I'm making a formal call for musicians, artists, dancers, sculptors, all artisans of the creative and entertainment industry to be seen as foreign exchange earners for Jamaica, and as such should benefit from the tax waivers and incentives on the tools of their trade. I want to reinforce our call for the amendment of the Noise Abatement Act and to lend our support for that, as well as the building of permanent concert venues. Mr. Speaker, medical tourism is valued at $120 billion US dollars, with more than 2.5 million people traveling all over the world to get medical procedures. Why? Because of cost. So what is happening now is that people are leaving first world countries for procedures that would normally cost $11,000 US dollars. They can get it in overseas jurisdictions for about a fraction of the cost, anywhere between $1,500 to $2,000 US. And so they're going to Cayman, Panama, Domrep, Mexico, Brazil, Jamaica, India for knee surgery. Jamaica is already ideally located to take advantage of the worldwide growth in this area. But let's go all in. We keep talking about these platitudes and cliches. I've been here for 12 years, I keep hearing them. When I mean go all in, design the economy, and let's dive in head or first. There are no shades of gray. It's either black or white. And so I want us to provide incentives for doctors or estheticians or registered nurses or dentists or nutritionists or physiotherapists or chiropractors, and to make it work, to make medical tourism work, Minister. I have an excellent dermatologist who could expand her customer base in skincare to an overseas visitor market if she could be given the incentives to bring in the latest technology to be at first world standard. Mr. Speaker, we don't lack the expertise in Jamaica. We never have. What we lack is the courage and leadership and political will for both sides to take the decision to make it happen. Mr. Speaker, retirement villages is something that I've seen across the world. And I want to congratulate Jamaican developers who actually build facilities and have places like in St. Anne, etc., where persons use those residences as their second homes. And people are using these residences not only as Airbnb, but the retirement homes. A more idyllic setting for one's retirement other than Jamaica just can't be found. I don't care what anybody else has to say. No, we're not better than Jamaica. Straight. Our proximity to the U.S. market and our easy travel gateways are other advantages. Cold weather, high costs of living, and high health costs in the first world countries are leading others and many people to seek retirement options in Panama, in Mexico, and Costa Rica. They have created industries and villages for overseas retirement, with the average housing cost being about $30,000 US. Orlando has over 100,000 of these retirement homes in a particular area. Trelawney, St. Anne, and Hanover are best suited for these retirement villages. And how would you fund it? How would the government fund it, Minister of Finance? Have the NIS made money this year. Have the NIS or the NHT float a diaspora bond. And the money that you make back from the sales and the rental in raising the money overseas, pay back the bondholders. But let's just do it. There's land across St. Anne, Hanover, and Trelawney. And I guarantee you, if you start providing the kinds of jobs and the kind of foreign exchange earnings, not only do you increase and build your economy, but you actually have crime, and that will go down in those particular areas. Mr. Speaker, tourism for Jamaica has always done well. But we still have a far way to go, and I'm glad that I spoke after the Minister of Tourism today. Our emphasis must be on increasing the average spend per tourist while in Jamaica and increasing the available offerings to the weekend tourist market, and once again, attracting the luxury visitor. And I want to congratulate the Minister for some of the work that he's doing. He has known me from I was a tot. Still, Mr. Speaker, too many of our guests are being kept in their hotel rooms. TEF needs to help communities create more authentic tourist attractions. Tourists, Mr. Speaker, spend money on shopping and entertainment. I'm suggesting basically two things. One, Jamaica goes head-to-head with Panama. Establish a duty-free free zone. Let them come shop in Jamaica, pay the import duties as they leave. You can put it up in Trelawney. You can put it anywhere that we have land close to some of our international airports. But there's another thing I want to recommend, because when people go to visit a place, they're not going to visit and say, oh, I stayed at this hotel or that hotel. Yeah, that's important. But they're going for the experience. So people don't say, well, when I went to Disney World, some of them can't remember the hotel they stayed at. In the year 2000, the Member of Parliament for Northeast St. Anne at the time, Danny Melville, in his sectoral address, spoke to the need for more attractions. He said, and I quote, Seville Great House, for example, on its own, the cultural attraction is not enough. It must be a part of an entertainment package. Harken back to the medieval dining experience in Orlando, we need to seek out the assistance from experts in building theme entertainment. Ask Disney or Universal Studios to show us how to create an illusion built around the rich cultural heritage of the meeting point of our indigenous Taino gate-crashing European and imported African cultures at Seville, and how to sell that grand illusion to tourists. What we have here is an industry that must rely on creativity and imagery, not just the bare bones of historical and cultural significance. End of quote. As Minister of Culture, I helped to turn Seville into a museum. But 19 years later, Danny Melville's vision of the Seville package is yet to become a reality. All of us in here can't keep coming back year after year. I could have, the speech that I read from Danny Melville 19 years ago, it would be relevant today. It is really an indictment on us as legislators to really keep just pushing the economy in the same way that we've been pushing it. Time come, man, we could just do something and go all in and get it done. Mr. Speaker, agriculture. No, the government has the money, we can find it. And we can do it. Mr. Speaker, agriculture employs over 220,000 people and has the highest local value added of all industries. Raw materials and production are almost 100% local. However, we have failed in the last 50 years to improve the quality of life for the average Jamaican small farmer, largely because we have focused on the wrong crops and we don't do any agri-processing for major export or sale to the local hotels. We need to recalibrate the way the Ministry of Agriculture technocrats see the business of food. And the way legislators implement policy. Jamaica has over 50 products which have United States pre-clearance. Let's just choose 10 of them. Just choose 10 of the 50 and produce and give the farmers two things in principle: an ongoing guaranteed price for their goods, for their crops, and secondary processing to provide storage for processed goods for export. Just two things. Choose 10 of the 50 and let's just go all in and export it to make some money. Why am I buying cured mango strips from Indonesia and not the Jamaican equivalent? Why am I buying aloe and coconut water being produced somewhere else, imported back to Jamaica? Why am I asking the same questions 12 years later over and over and over again in this parliament? I've been asking the same thing over. You have been asking the same thing over and over. Don't matter. You have to start. Government must sit down one and one, regardless of if it's coconut or mango, whatever it is, we can choose. Government must sit down one-on-one with companies and do what is necessary to facilitate the establishment of these export facilities. Because of the actions of former Minister of Finance Peter Phillips in bringing interest rates down, pension funds and insurance companies are scrambling to look for investments in the real economy. These companies who are now importing these types of products with established markets locally need to list on the local stock exchange companies to manufacture agricultural finished products. Let's give those special incentives to these companies that list on the stock exchange for agricultural purposes, having regard to the significant value added they will create for our small farmers. Mr. Speaker, this is the new growth product of the 21st century: ganja, cannabis, kaya. Call it what you want to call it. Ganja, Jamaicans have known how to grow and smoke weed since them say Wapi kill Philip. My constituency grew the best weed up in the hills of Calderwood, 8 Mile, 9 Mile, Higgins Land. Yes, not St. Elizabeth. My farmers. Mr. Speaker, my farmers know good weed and know how to grow it. But in less than 5 years, there'll be very little value in growing weed in Jamaica. It'll be like any other commodity. The true value in the future of ganja, cannabis, and I call it ganja because I don't want the world to take away our brand, will be in pharmaceuticals and branding. But today, no small farmer with historical know-how will ever meet the standards now required for production. The licensing authority is approaching it as if every applicant wants to become an exporter. This established bureaucracy is locking out our small farmers, Mr. Speaker. The same one who created the product so many years ago and suffered at the hands of the police for something which is now a global sensation and is legal in several countries have no way of getting a slice of that taste. It's them do it, it's them build it. If those small farmers never go up in the hills for 3-4 months and sit down and hide, you wouldn't know about Jamaican good ganja. Straight. The government must establish and fund a facility in partnership with one of our universities to allow small farmers to manufacture and process their raw weed for a fee. Into products that the market demands. This must be a national lab. It must be a national Jamaican lab. So when the Israelis or the Coloradians or anybody else hear about it, they must know that they can come to the Jamaican National Ganja Lab. And Mr. Speaker, this lab must have the added responsibility of promoting Jamaican ganja, the best in the world. Mr. Speaker, we need to stand up for our ganja brand, right? We need to stand up for it. We have the competitive advantage of branding of this product in the world, but this is disappearing fast, and I don't want to see it disappear. All of us have an obligation to make sure that we don't see it disappear. Mr. Speaker, I had hoped to end my presentation on this high, but there's something else that I'm extremely passionate about, which is Jamaica and Jamaicans first. Mr. Speaker, we live in a God-blessed country. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Just 5.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members' time be extended sufficient to allow her to complete her presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Ms. Hanna.
Thank you, member. Mr. Speaker, we all live in a God-blessed country, and every day I give thanks to be born Jamaican. I do. I really do. We should welcome everyone to our shores and encourage them to enjoy our country. However, it must come at a price. In the United States, they have something called a Minority Affirmative Action Plan, which recognizes that we're all equal under God. However, we're all not blessed with equal opportunity. It is difficult to expect the average Jamaican living in poor circumstances without the best education to compete with the skill sets of the newly arrived foreign investor, wholesaler, or technician. I am therefore recommending 2 things in principle. 1, there needs to be a differential in the licensing fees for locals and foreigners who wish to do business in Jamaica. And that differential, Mr. Speaker, must be favorable on both sides, but make sure that there is a differential. Number 2, as a requirement for all work permits above a certain level, a condition should be imposed that a Jamaican must be employed for understudy for a period not less than 2 years. So if you're coming in to invest and you say that, look, you don't have this talent or expertise here, no problem. You can bring your expertise, but you have to put a Jamaican beside you, and they have to understudy you in 2 years, and then your person has to actually go. Those are the 2 condition precedences, so the knowledge transfer is important. Mr. Speaker, James Ingram has a song which says, just once, can we figure out what we keep doing wrong? Why we never last for very long? Just once, can we find a way to finally make it right? To make the magic last for more than just one night? If we could just get through it. I know we could break through it. Mr. Speaker, in Jamaica we have JAMPRO, we have the Economic Growth Council, we have the Ministry of Economic Growth, we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Coordinating Unit for Foreign Trade, we have the Ministry of Agriculture, and I could go on. What we need is less bureaucracy and not more. The trade policy confirms on page 53, and I quote, "For the majority of the last 50 years, imports have generally increased, while exports of goods have remained relatively stable." This is not a formula for success, Mr. Speaker. This is not a formula for prosperity. I'll end as I began. Our mindset as legislators need to radically change towards becoming a value-added export country. We also need to realize that we can't be all things to all people. We must focus on products through which we have a worldwide competitive advantage in. To succeed in any one of them, just one, and have even 1% market share would transform Jamaica to a country we all say we desire. Mr. Speaker, we've been approaching the concept of national growth and development in the same way for 30-odd years. The time has come to take a different path. Let's try something new, just once. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it is fair to say that that was indeed an excellent presentation. Mr. Speaker, I ask for the recommittal of notices of motion given oral.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Notice of motion given orally.
Mr. Speaker, at notices of motions given orally by my colleague from St. Andrew North East, I ask that the notices which were given early be confirmed or approved by this House.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House I will move the following motion. Whereas subsection 1GI of section 41 of the Constitution of Jamaica requires a member of this Honourable House of Representatives to vacate his seat if any firm in which he is a partner or any company of which he is a director or manager becomes a party to any contract with the Government of Jamaica for or on account of the public service, or if he becomes a partner in a firm or a director or manager of a company which is a party to any such contract. And whereas the Member of Parliament for St. Catharines Southern is a director of Celestial Farms Jamaica Limited and a shareholder and director of Suntrax Investments Limited, a joint venture partnership in Celestial Farms Limited, and these entities may from time to time enter into contracts with the Government of Jamaica and its agencies. And whereas the member has disclosed his interest in the above entities, be it resolved that this motion be referred to the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move that the motion, notice of which I gave earlier, be approved.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today, so I invite you to adjourn this Honourable House until next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. It had, as I hear sotto voce remarks, it was the intention to have a presentation by the Prime Minister on the matter of water supplies. The time is well spent, and there are additional pieces of information. There are additional pieces of information that would facilitate the presentation wondrously. So we therefore ask that this be postponed until next week, Tuesday, when he will give that presentation, Mr. Speaker.
Question is that the House be now adjourned until next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned.